At this time, I'm going to be reading Daniel chapter 1, after which Pastor Justin will be coming forward and will be leading us in today's sermon. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles for the temple of God. Then he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put the treasure in the house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's presence some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. Then the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names: to Daniel the name Belshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and waters to drink." And at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds, and every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them. And he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Thus far, the reading of God's word.
Thanks be to God. So I've shared this story before. I've shared it in several places. I shared it here several years ago. So if you've heard it, you're going to hear it again. But not that long ago, a couple of years ago, I was on an elevator, and a woman's like staring at me, and she randomly asks me, "Where are you from?" And at the time, I was just kind of jarred by the question. I really didn't know what she meant, and I just kind of stuttered, "I'm from here, New York." To which she then replied, "No, like, where are you from?" Many of you here, I would imagine, have had a similar kind of conversation with people because, especially in the U.S., if you are not white, someone has probably asked you some version of that question. And often it's a question out of curiosity. There's no animus there. It's just a reminder, though, of how people view you. And over the course of my life, I have had some version of this conversation over and over and over again, in large part because I'm so ethnically ambiguous. People can't ever quite place me. And so again, I've had to field this question many, many times over the years, and I always struggle with how to know how best to respond. In large part because people often want just a really nice, clean answer, but the answer to that question for me is very complicated, and I'm never really sure if they want the whole answer. Because the real answer to that question, if you don't know, is that my mom, she was born and raised in Nagaland, but because no one's ever heard of Nagaland, I always need to explain Nagaland to people. Nagaland is now a state of India, in northeast India, made up of indigenous tribal people. But as a result of European colonial powers getting involved in regions that are not their own, and then drawing lines and borders that are not theirs to draw, Nagaland, this region, was forcibly made part of India by the British and Indian governments. And so, as a result, there's been a lot of tension between Nagaland and India. Over the years, there's been real resistance movements and even guerrilla warfare in the region. I have some really fun stories related to that, being a kid in the midst of that environment. But though Nagas, as a people, are now part of India, they really have little to no ethnic or cultural ties to India, but are nonetheless categorized as Indian by national identity, at least by those who are not Naga. However, in addition, if I do genetic testing, which I've done, because these were tribal people for thousands and thousands of years, 23andMe has no idea how to categorize the Naga people. And so when I do genetic testing, I'm like 50% Chinese Tibetan on my mom's side. So, to summarize all of that, my mom is culturally Naga, nationalistically Indian, and apparently genetically Chinese. And that's just on my mom's side. On my dad's side, my grandfather was Lebanese. My grandmother mostly had European roots, but also I have family from Chile in that mix. My family has been terrible at keeping it within any one ethnic or cultural or racial group. Purity has not been a concern for us. It's not our thing. All of that said, the woman on the elevator wasn't looking for that answer. She simply thought, hey, there's something different about you. You don't seem like you're from here. Where are you from? That question, where are you from? Where is home? Those are powerful questions to be asked, especially when your identity is rooted in a place and with people that are different than those that currently surround you. And that experience is probably best understood in the biblical category of exile. To be in exile is to be home, but not really truly home. It's to experience a sense of connectedness with where you are and yet know that's not really where you ultimately belong. And here's going to be the main point. In many ways, the Christian life is a life of exile. It's a life of being home, but never really being home. Now today we're starting a new series looking at the book of Daniel. We've entitled it Strangers and Sovereigns, Being a Countercultural People. The book of Daniel highlights this central idea of being in exile, the constant tension we are inevitably going to feel, being strangers in a foreign land, a land that is ruled by sovereigns who come and go. And in the midst of that tension, the tension of being a people who are loyal to an ultimate sovereign, what does it mean to be a countercultural people who live engaged and live faithful in the places where they are, and yet, at the same time, are also a distinct people, especially when the forces around us are competing for our loyalty and our affections? What does it mean to be a faithful exile who is home but not really home? And today what I want to do is set the stage for us in the book of Daniel. What will we set the stage for what we'll see over the coming 12 weeks or so? What does the book of Daniel say about being in exile and how we are to live as a people, Christian, as a people in exile? Let's consider this story as three types of stories. It's a story of exile, it's a story of faithfulness, and it's finally a story of a promise. All right, let's consider each of those today. First, a story of exile. So again, let me set the stage for what's happening in the book of Daniel. The book starts by noting that in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, what's really helpful about that is right from the beginning of Daniel, we can place the story historically. So in verse 1, what I just read, also we see this a bit in verse 21, it tells us that Daniel essentially ministered in the late 7th century into the early 6th century BC. This makes him contemporaries. If you care about some of biblical history, he's a contemporary of the prophet Jeremiah and the prophet Ezekiel. Now, this siege that came on Israel, it's important that the siege didn't occur in a vacuum. This isn't some random event. I don't want to get fully into the whole scope of the history of Israel at the time, but by this point in history, Israel's history, the kingdom of Israel had split into two separate kingdoms. You had the northern kingdom, which was Israel, and then you had the southern kingdom, which was known as Judah. Now, the northern kingdom had fallen to the Assyrians about 130 years prior to these events. But now, there's this much more powerful nation that's come on the scene. The Assyrians ruled for many years, but now the Babylonians have come. And the Babylonians are taking over everything. They've conquered the Assyrians, and now they've come for the southern kingdom of Israel, Judah. The Babylonians have now just taken Jerusalem, right? This central city of God. Now, some at the time would have certainly seen this conquest, Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Jerusalem. They would have been asking themselves after this conquest, where is Yahweh in the midst of all of this? Has Yahweh been defeated by allowing his people to be conquered? Was our God, Yahweh, too weak to defeat the gods of this empire, Babylon? And because people would have been thinking this, Daniel makes note in verse 2 that the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hands. In other words, Jerusalem didn't fall because Yahweh lacked the power to defend his people. Instead, God used Nebuchadnezzar as an instrument to bring a covenantal discipline on his people. Why? Well, the whole context of this fall of Israel, north and south, was the fact that Israel had become a wicked nation. They had become a nation full of idolatrous injustice. And so as a result, God sent his people into exile, and God used the Babylonians to do it. Now, here's what's interesting. The Babylonians, they were a brutal people, and they very easily could have just obliterated Israel, because the power that they had was unmatched. Right? So they could have wiped Israel off the face of the planet, and yet they didn't. God restrained the Babylonians. And so what we see here is that Babylon doesn't come in and destroy the people of Israel. Instead, what they do is they come in, they defeat them militarily, but then they take the best and the brightest of Israel, and they take them back to Babylon. And the reason why they do that is they want to enculturate them and use the best and the brightest. If they could make the best and the brightest Babylonians, they could then send them back to the people and make the entire nation Babylonian. So this wasn't just a military defeat that we're seeing here. The Babylonians also wanted a complete and total cultural revolution in Israel. The Babylonians were going to strip Israel of everything that made them a distinct people. And that's where we have Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That's where they now enter. These were the best of the best. These were the most wise, the strongest, the best looking, as we just heard read. And of course, these are people who may be better known as Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Just to point out, this was step one for the Babylonians. Give these men Babylonian names. Strip them of their Hebrew names. They now have Babylonian names. These were the best and the brightest. And they are now in exile in Babylon. They are now in their new home, even as they inevitably are longing to return to their true home. And so here's the question, the fundamental question for Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What does it mean to be a faithful people in this pagan land? That brings us, secondly, to this is being a story of faithfulness. Though they've been taken away, though they're now in exile, they are still the people of God. Right? That hasn't changed. They are still the people whom God has chosen. They are still the people that God led out of Egypt. They are still the people that God protected and to whom he gave victory, and he eventually gave them a land to call their own. They are the people to whom God has always been faithful to his covenant promises to them, even when they were not faithful. And though God used the Babylonians to bring this righteous judgment against the people as a result of their grave injustices, God is nonetheless committed to the promises that he made with them. And so as a result, they are still his people. They are still to be a distinct people, called to be faithful. And so as a result, they must resist this assimilation that the Babylonians are attempting. They must resist becoming Babylonians, and instead they must maintain what it means to be a distinct people of Yahweh. Now, over the course of the series, we're going to see various examples of how Daniel and his friends resist assimilating into Babylonian culture. But I want us to notice where the book of Daniel starts, what it's highlighting here. The first, as I just said, one of the first ways that the Babylonians were going to try and strip these men of their Hebrew identity is to give them new names, which presumably they received without resistance, by the way. We don't have any explicit resistance to these new names, which, by the way, each of those new Babylonian names were names that evoked the Babylonian pantheon of pagan gods. So these Hebrew men dedicated to Yahweh have now been given these pagan, idolatrous names. But then look at verse 17. It says this, "To these 4 men God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds." We'll come back to that later. "In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the whole kingdom." Here's what that tells me. There's a few things that we can draw out from there. That there was a way in which Daniel and his friends were actually able to engage, and engage well, with the pagan culture that they found themselves in. That's important to note. They engaged this pagan culture, they served this pagan land, and yet they were nonetheless faithful. They didn't resist at every turn. They didn't turn everything into an opportunity to clash. They even supported this pagan king by giving wisdom on how this pagan king could govern his pagan land. You know, this is very indicative of what God would say elsewhere to the people in exile. Famously in Jeremiah 29, the prophet, speaking to the same reality of what's going on here, the prophet confronts those who at the time, on the one hand, there were those who were saying to the people, they were encouraging people that they needed to become recluse. They needed to, while they were in exile, they needed to reject everything about the Babylonian home that they found themselves in. Some people were encouraging that. But then on the other end of the spectrum, there were also people who were telling them, just accept your fate. Just capitulate to what the Babylonians desire from you. But then you had Jeremiah who comes and says, no, be a distinct people in this land. Make sure that you remain faithful to who you are as a people of God. But as you do that, Jeremiah also tells them to build homes and to have children and to give those children in marriage. And then famously, in verse 7 of Jeremiah 29, he says, also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into Babylon. Engage well. Serve this pagan land that you now find yourself in. Make this your home. But as you do, be a distinct people. Why is that important? That means that not everything, even in this pagan land, was to be resisted. Not everything that was present in this pagan land was the result of unfaithfulness. There was good that was there. You know, this is fundamentally what we call God's common grace. It's a type of grace that God gives to all creation, all people, all nations, even pagan ones, where there are good things within that culture that can be appreciated and enjoyed, and where real human flourishing can even take place. The challenge, however, is that as one enjoys it all, these people are nonetheless called to be a distinct and faithful people in the midst of those surroundings. So for Daniel and his friends, where was their line? I mean, it's clear that they were engaging. They were serving this pagan king, but where was the line where they would know they would not cross that line? Well, after receiving these new names, look at verse 8. Verse 8 tells us, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. Interesting. That was the line. This was the first line anyway. They would not defile themselves with royal food and wine. Here's what's interesting about that. There's actually a lot of debate about why that was the line for them, why they refused the food. Some argue that the reason why they refused the food is because of the dietary laws of Israel. They wanted to stay pure, and so they weren't going to eat this food that was unclean. But I don't know if that's the case, because meat and wine, the foods that they were offered, those weren't restricted by the dietary laws of Israel. The Israelites ate meat. They drank wine. So I don't know if that's quite it. Others would say, well, maybe these foods, they were first used as pagan sacrifices. And so because they were offered to the gods of the Babylonians, Daniel and his friends refused to eat that food. Maybe, but presumably, all the food that they were given, including the vegetables that they eventually ate, would also have been offered to these pagan gods. Plus, that is the exact scenario in 1 Corinthians 8, if you remember, when Paul says that it's a conscience issue about eating meat that's sacrificed to idols. And granted, that's a New Testament thing that comes many, many years later, but it at least implies that there's nothing necessarily evil in even eating that which has been offered to these pagan gods. So what's going on there? Well, we get a little bit of an insight in the word that's translated defile in our passage, that they do not want to defile themselves. There are several different Hebrew words that get translated as defile, but this word, galal, speaks of a moral state and Daniel's agency in being formed here. Daniel did not want to be formed. He did not want to be defiled by the formation that was taking place in Babylon. In other words, for Daniel, to eat from Nebuchadnezzar's table would be to allow the empire to begin forming him, to not just change his location or force a new language or give him new education. This is about the way in which he's being formed as a person, his loyalties. There was something about the food that spoke to loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. How? Well, the food at the king's table, it was designed to make these men grateful and even addicted to what the king could provide. This food was supposed to give them strength and wisdom, and if they had the strength and the wisdom, the king could say, this is because of me. It's because of what I have given to them. It was a way of making them loyal, dependent, and even grateful to the king for their strength. And accepting it would have allowed the king to assume that he was their source. Accepting that assumption for Daniel would have crossed the line. Allowing the king to assume that he was their source is what would have defiled Daniel. For him to be a faithful and distinct people who trusted Yahweh, he needed to draw the line here. I trust Yahweh, not the food of your table, king. Now, ultimately, Daniel doesn't just refuse the meal. The bottom line is that he's refusing to be formed by the power and resources of this empire. That formation, that dependence is where Daniel says, no thanks. Now, let me pull all this together for us. I started by saying that the experience of exile is the experience of the Christian life. To be a Christian is to live as an exile. 1 Peter 2, Peter tells us that Christians are foreigners and exiles, and that our citizenship is not in the nations of this world, but as Paul says, we are citizens of heaven, Christian. So like Daniel, Christians are a people of another kingdom. But the place in which we inhabit now, they're pagan lands, seeking to assimilate us into the cultural rhythms and expectations of that land. But as exiles, while we are to embrace and engage the homes in which we find ourselves, to seek the peace and the prosperity of the cities in which we live, we are also called to resist the formation that comes. We are to be faithful to another land, for this is not our home. Now, this is a little bit of a side note, but it's very much worth noting, this context that we all find ourselves in right now. It is incredibly deceptive to assume that anyone lives in a Christian nation. There is no such thing as a Christian nation. The only Christian nation is the kingdom of God, ultimately. Some nations, granted, may be more closely aligned with the priorities and the laws of God, but we cannot be deceived into believing that nations, as much as we might want to claim them to be Christian nations, they're nonetheless idolatrous. They're nonetheless full of idolatrous paganism, and that includes our nation. In many ways, though there may be many voices that speak to the contrary, the United States is a pagan land. And yet we are called by God as exiles in the United States, as exiles in this foreign pagan land, to engage and seek the peace and prosperity of this land. All nations fail miserably in comparison to the kingdom of God. All nations, in some way, are full of the same kinds of idolatrous wickedness and injustice that Israel saw, that was present in Babylon. That is why, no matter where Christians find themselves, we are always exiles in a foreign land. So that's the question then, like Daniel then, where do we have to begin drawing the line, refusing to be formed by the empire? Where is it that we need to refuse the king's proverbial meals that are being offered to us? And be assured that there are Nebuchadnezzars today that also want us dependent on them. The challenge is that today, nobody's handing us a royal plate of food, demanding that we eat it. The formation of today happens gradually and tends to happen much more under the radar. We don't even realize sometimes that it's happening. We often choose the defilements of today, one small consumption at a time, because again, the Nebuchadnezzars of today want to form us. They want to form our imagination, our ideologies. They want to reframe our loyalties. And the food of these modern Nebuchadnezzars often come down to encouraging us into lives of comfort and security and status and belonging. Like the food system of Babylon, our food today is being used to create a dependence on and a trust in them. And today, I do fear that at times we regularly and uncritically pick up the fork of this formation. Let me give you some examples. The algorithms of social media, like the food for Daniel, might not necessarily be bad in and of itself, but it's certainly not neutral. They are carefully engineered systems designed to tell you who you are, what you lack, who your enemies are, and what kind of person you ought to be if you want to find a sense of belonging. They form our sense of worth by highlighting what gets liked and what gets ignored. The algorithms tell you what to be afraid of and who you are to fear. And we consume it so much that it's created an environment where people will even trade their freedom or the freedom of their neighbors just for a sense of feeling like they're safe or like they belong. Many have not even noticed the ways in which they've been discipled by the empire. And we just keep opening the apps. And it's not just social media. I mean, the entertainment we consume is shaping all kinds of things about what we believe about the world. It's shaping the way that our views of sex and relationships, and it's shaping the way that we view what we ought to desire, what is good, what is right desire. Even more, our media even tells us what our faces and our bodies are supposed to look like. And the message underneath all of it is always the same: you're not enough as you are. And the comedy of that is that the primary message is going to be, you are enough. And yet, everything about the way we're discipled tells us you'll never meet the standards that we've put in front of you. Your personhood, your personality, your body, they're commodities. And your worth is tied to how well you manage and change them to meet expectations. This is very much forming us. I mean, even the very structures of our day are forming us. As much as I love same-day delivery, instant gratification, frictionless everything is deeply forming us. And it's forming us to believe that inconvenience and even suffering have no redemptive value. Our consumption economy is forming our views of generosity and our responsibility to the most vulnerable amongst us. Why? Because everything becomes about me. and what I need right now. Generosity and mercy and sacrifice, in many ways, those are liabilities. Those are not virtues today. The empire has also presented a very clear catechism about what a successful life ought to look like. Your title, your neighborhood, the schools that your kids attend, the activities that they are a part of, or the trajectory of their lives are so often formed by the priorities of the empire. In many ways, if we were to look at our lives, are they really distinct from the pagan land in which we find ourselves? I find it to be true that often they're not. We're formed by a pagan culture that is uninterested in our claims to ultimate fidelity to an ultimate sovereign. Instead, it just forms us into the ways of the empire. And again, like Daniel, the food of our day might not in and of itself be that bad. Nothing I just named in and of itself is bad. The algorithms aren't necessarily bad. Entertainment isn't necessarily bad. Having goals for your life and for the lives of your kids, whatever it might be, those aren't necessarily bad. But I do wonder if we've consumed uncritically, and in the end, we've been formed to the point of being defiled. If we are honest, many of us in this room, and I can place myself in this as well, many of us in this room are defiled because unlike Daniel, we have not drawn the line and said, no, I refuse to be dependent on, loyal to that which is presented to me. Friends, we often are being conformed to the patterns of the world in which we find ourselves every day, and more, if we are not conscious of that formation, we more and more become loyal to those patterns over what it means to be God's distinct people in this land. So if that's true, and it is, what empowers our ability to resist that formation, to resist the formation of the patterns of this world, and instead, in the words of Romans 12, to be transformed by the renewing of our minds? What is required for us to resist? Well, that brings us finally, that we need to see this not only as a story of exile, a story of faithfulness, but also finally a story of promise. I said a moment ago that the people of Israel, they're in exile because they were an unfaithful people. They had become unjust, so God brings them into exile. And yet, despite their unfaithfulness, God nonetheless stayed faithful to them. He did not allow them to be completely destroyed, and the promises that he made very much still remain. I mean, he would promise one day that they will return home. He promised that they would be a people that would bless the nations, and that promise still remained. He was still faithful to them. A people that could have easily have been wiped out by the Babylonians are instead preserved by God so that they might usher in the fullness of God's kingdom through the work of one who would come that would be a truly faithful servant of God in exile in a pagan land. I mean, this whole story is driving us toward one ultimate aim. And what is that aim? That there would be another that would come who knew the experience of exile, an exile that you and I will never fully know. Daniel is in exile, and he chooses further exile from the king's table in order to remain faithful to God. But here's what Daniel is pointing us to. Here is the gospel, that this is but a mere shadow of what is to come in the greater, fuller Daniel, which is Jesus. I mean, Jesus, he left a table. He left the table of heaven, the feast of glory, the place of true welcome, and he does so. When he does so, he enters into our exile. He didn't come to remain distant from the power of the empire. He was born into the power of an empire. The principalities and the powers of this world, he enters into their rule over where we are today. And in every way, right, the beauty of what Jesus accomplishes is that he refuses to be formed by the powers of this world. He remained truly faithful. And that faithfulness eventually led him to the point of death on the cross. He enters our exile so that he might keep his promise that he will bring his people home. On the cross, when Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He's experiencing the ultimate exile of forsakenness so that we, a rebellious people, might be welcomed in him as a faithful people. Jesus experiences exile so that we might experience home. It's what this whole story of Daniel is driving us to see. And so the call then to be a distinct countercultural people is not just about trying harder to be like Daniel, though we ought to try and be more like Daniel. It is also a call for us to be found in the one who is the truly faithful exile who leads us home. It's the one who was in the world but not of it, perfectly and completely. In him, friends, our defilements, they're covered. Jesus covers us and he welcomes us into the presence of God. And by his Spirit, we are being formed slowly and surely. As we trust in him, slowly but surely, we're being formed into a people who can finally faithfully push back against the wrong tables of today, who can recognize the formation of the food that we're presented and finally be able to say, no, I'll draw the line here, for my loyalties are elsewhere, to another nation, another sovereign. And when we take seriously what it is that Jesus has done on our behalf, entered our exile in order to bring us home, it does make it so much easier for us to recognize the Nebuchadnezzars of today and to resist the allure of what they present so that we might be found faithful. So friends, today and over the course of the coming weeks, as we consider more fully what it means to be this exiled people, the way in which we stay faithful in the midst of all the pagan lands we find ourselves in is to look at our King, the one who is truly sovereign, who rules and reigns over another kingdom, and that kingdom is our home. It's a home that we're welcomed into. And I pray that that King and his kingdom shape us now to be distinct people wherever it is we might find ourselves. Let's pray. Our Father, Lord, we do thank you that though we are, like Israel, a rebellious people, and though often we do not take seriously what it means for us to remain a distinct people in the lands in which we find ourselves, even though all of that's true, it's also the case that you're a God who keeps his promises. And you've made promises to us. And that ultimate promise is that if we would rest and hope and trust in our King, Jesus, the one who stepped into exile on our behalf, if we would trust in him, you will be faithful to bring us home. And so, Lord, I pray today you would help us, by the power of your Spirit, help us look upon our Savior afresh. To remember once again what it is that he's accomplished for us, that he stepped into our exile. He covers our defilements and he brings us home. Spirit of God, would you help us be a distinct people in this land? Would you help us to engage well, to serve well, to seek the peace and prosperity of this land, and yet do so in a distinct way that makes it clear that our loyalties are ultimately elsewhere. God, make it so amongst us.